Hey folks, welcome to the Thursday edition of the Whitfield Report podcast. I'm your host, Savage Sam Whitfield here, recording from NGC Studios for the Thursday edition. And I'm so glad that you are here to join me whenever you're listening to this in the past, present, future hour. And it's good to be back for the Thursday edition. We've been off for a few weeks from the Thursday show. I had final exams last week, as most of you know who tune in regularly to the podcast. And, I missed last week's Thursday edition because of that. But I think I made up for it with Saturday's show, last Saturday's show with Jimmy. And, I did a show on Tuesday, which wasn't my best, but it wasn't my worst either. I thought it was pretty good. But anyway, I want to thank you so much for joining me for the Thursday edition. As always, we should be back to our regular scheduled programming by now, so you can expect these on Thursday again regularly. All right, folks, contact info, as usual. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at 70_NDC, hashtag Whitfield Report, hashtag Sam Savages, facebook.com/Whitfield Report, Gab and Minds at Sam Whitfield, and, subscribe to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/The Whitfield Report, and you can also subscribe to the podcast over on Anchor, anchor.fm/Whitfield Report Pod to find all the links for Apple Podcasts and everything else there. And thesamwhitfield.com is my main website /blog. All right, folks. So, as you know by now, Thursdays are usually when I review stuff related to, popular culture, movies, TV shows, comic books, music, really anything that strikes my fancy, I review it. And we have another comic book TV show that has recently launched. There's been a lot of good ones that have come out over the past couple of years. There's been most notably, one of my favorites that has come out was Netflix's adaptation of the Daredevil comic book. That whole series as part of Netflix's kind of MCU extension. Then we had The Punisher that was pretty good, and Jessica Jones that was good. I think Daredevil was the best out of all those MCU Netflix shows when it was on, and whatnot. And then we also have The Boys from Amazon, which is very dark but very well done as well. So that's the thing. Of course, we have Arrow and The Flash, which both of those shows are on the CW, and I was actually surprised at how well those shows did the first couple seasons that they were both on. The CW, as most everyone knows, is notorious for, basically turning every single one of their shows into a soap opera, of sorts, to attract their teenage girl demographic. And, for a while, it seemed like Arrow and Flash, were kind of successfully heading away from the total soap opera directions. And then, these last, 2 seasons, both of those shows kind of dropped the bomb on that. And now they have the Batwoman show, which I'm not even going to review that because, pretty much like that's another show where the critics are liking that one because it's woke. but the comic book fans and the audience that is at home aren't liking that one at all. So it's not even worth reviewing that one. One show that I've kind of brought up over the past couple of years as it's been in development is the Watchmen TV show that HBO has done. This is what has essentially now filled Game of Thrones' old time slot, from what I understand. And, this Netflix TV series is it's not an adaptation of the Watchmen comic book from 1986, so much as it is like a spin-off sequel to the Watchmen comic book series and the graphic novel, which I said then and I'll say again, I have a huge problem with the fact that a Watchmen sequel even exists, and I'll get to why here in a sec. But a couple of you guys have, asked me to review the series, and to kind of give my thoughts on the first episode, so I wasn't able to watch it on Sunday. Obviously, again, I had final projects I had to finish up, the previous weekend, so I didn't get a chance to watch it live, but I did watch it, on HBO last night, Wednesday night, I should say, is when I watched it. So, I'm going to give my thoughts and opinions on that. And let me just say, I don't know what to make of it. I'm not too happy with how it's started out, but I'll get to that in a sec. First off, I kind of want to start off this review by going over the original Watchmen graphic novel and the Zack Snyder Watchmen movie, because those two, the Watchmen comic book and, / graphic novel, let me just say, has always been very near and dear to my heart as a comic book fan, as it is for many, hardcore comic book fans. It's one of the greatest graphic novels of all time, and the first time that I read the Watchmen graphic novel was actually, believe it or not, 10 years ago now. And that was because the movie at the time by Zack Snyder was coming out. That movie came out in 2009, and it's now 2019. I was 14 when that movie came out, and before that movie, hit theaters, a bunch of my friends and I who, were kind of anticipating that movie. We had never read the Watchmen graphic novel before, so we all did in anticipation of that, movie coming out then, and the Watchmen series, for those of you who don't know, although I know the vast majority of the audience that listens to me actually does know what Watchmen is, but for the uninitiated, the Watchmen series was published by DC Comics between 1986 and 1987. It was a 12-issue limited, series, meaning it's a self-contained story. It was, although it was published by DC Comics, it took place in its own, universe and had its own story, completely, as opposed to being tied into the, DC universe directly at the time. Although they've changed that, in which we'll get into that later in the podcast, but like back when it was published, it was its own standalone thing. It had no connections with the DC universe, when it was published. And the premise of the Watchmen graphic novel, or the series, I should say, is it's basically the premise of like, well, what if superheroes and costumed vigilantes actually existed in our world and had to deal with like the real world consequences, of being superpowered individuals or being vigilantes. Like how would that play out, in reality? Now, in 2019, that concept is nothing new because, as I said, we've had series like The Boys, where things are pretty realistic, and a lot of stories in the Marvel and DC universe have become pretty realistic. But you have to remember, like back in even like back in the 1980s, and even more so, prior to that, comic books were pretty, they were pretty safe as far as like, formulas would go. You had the hero and, the villain. Villain would do something bad. The hero would, go and stop it, and sometimes you would get foiled like in the first act, but in the second act of the story, the hero would always win, and it was always understood that the old timey heroes, while they may have had struggles, in their personal lives, at the end of the day, they were always, good, upstanding, moral people. And, like even during Stan Lee's, run of Marvel Comics in the 60s and 70s, and no disrespect to Stan Lee, I've done a whole tribute episode, to him and the impact, he made. He certainly explored character, flaws in his heroes, but not to the, extent that Watchmen did. I mean, Watchmen got like really nitty gritty, and, part of that was because when Stan Lee was publishing comics, during the 60s and 70s when he was head of Marvel, there were just subjects that, back in his day, he wouldn't have been able to explore even if he wanted to, I don't think. But by the mid 80s, when Watchmen came out, comic books were certainly ready to explore like more mature themes. There was Batman Year One, which was written by Frank Miller, and kind of reimagined the Batman origin story, but in a much grittier way. We actually get to see like Gotham City's corruption of the politicians and of the police force explored much more in depth. We see in that version that Catwoman is a is a prostitute, but she's also kind of like a hit woman, slash something for hire, and that's why she has the whip. That's why she has the cat motif that's, very sexual. We get to see a bit more into Bruce Wayne's psychology, and like that was like one of the first, kind of adult comics. Not necessarily that it was like super explicit, but that it explored, like really adult ideas and really adult themes. Then we have The Dark Knight Returns, which, takes a look at an older Batman, in his 60s who's been retired. And again, it's a much, grittier look at Batman and, deals with some pretty adult themes and adult ideas. Right? So even, kind of like the mainstream stories were able to put, more boundaries in the comic book world. I mean, hell, The Punisher, Frank Castle, that entire, character is about, being a veteran with PTSD, dealing with corruption, killing, criminals, and being a vigilante. That's essentially the Punisher's whole thing. And in the 80s, he kind of became big too. Well, then, the Watchmen came along, and really, at that point, Watchmen changed everything. Watchmen was a book where each of the characters, whether it be Rorschach, Dr. Manhattan, the comedian whose, murder is kind of, is kind of what the whole entire series is, planned around, Adrian Veidt, Ozymandias, Dr. Manhattan, Night Owl, Silk Spectre, her mother, and Silk Spectre 2. All of these characters have, traits that make them heroes and have traits that could also make them be considered villains in the eyes of some, right? So they're superheroes and they're vigilantes, but they're all very much flawed. And, Watchmen is really a character study wrapped up in in a superhero comic book. And it's very mature, too. They deal with, actual situations like, rape, incest. There's like, I think there's a gay superhero that gets killed early on, in the story, and there's a lesbian superhero that gets killed, early on, and this is back in like the mid '80s, during like the Reagan administration, so like now, like I said, we've become, I guess, progressive enough, in culture to where like, that's normal. But considering, back then it was pretty groundbreaking. So it really shows that, the humanity of these costumed, heroes. Both, their good flaws and their bad flaws. And, it ultimately asks the question, in the end, of, is a utopia possible? Right? That's the kind of the ending, question, without giving any major spoilers away of what it is. So, again, I know a lot of people who listen to this show and, know what comic books are probably know what the Watchmen is, but for those of you who don't, let me just tell you that it's definitely worth reading the graphic novel. In fact, like, I would read the graphic novel, for sure before you watch the movie or watch the TV series. Also, it's one of those graphic novels, where honestly you need to read it more than once. I've read it probably about like 8 or 9 times. I've read the graphic novel almost every year since I originally read it, and every time I get something new out of it. It's just one of those stories and one of those character studies of, people, these heroes and these villains, that is just so compelling that, like, every time you read it, you get something new out of it, where you realize, oh, I never realized this detail, or, I thought of this detail one way before, but now, as I've gotten older, this detail actually means this. So it's definitely something like that. It's not one to, read just once and then put away. You're going to want to read this thing, more than once. And right now, it's only $5 on Amazon Digital on Comixology, which is the Amazon digital comics platform. So it's $5 right now. Very good deal. Obviously, Amazon is not a sponsor of this podcast, not yet anyway. But it's worth picking up. If you want to get the actual graphic novel, in paperback or in hardcover, which I have, it's not too much money. It'll set you back like $10 or $15. So not bad. Either way, I highly recommend the graphic novel. And, with that in mind, now we're going to go into spoiler territory of the new series, of the HBO series, Watchmen, or as I like to call it, the Wokemen. So, we're going to go into spoiler territory here. So, this will be a signal that we're going into spoiler territory. And we're now officially in spoiler territory, ladies and gentlemen. So if you're listening to this and you haven't seen the Watchmen TV series yet, or the graphic novel, or the movie, go ahead and read the graphic novel first and watch the TV series before listening to this podcast. Unless you're one of those people who, as I mentioned before, doesn't mind spoilers, and as always, if that's the case, well, don't come complaining to me when I've spoiled something for you. Okay, that's the arrangement we have here. That's our, silent, little arrangement here. I warn you of spoilers, you listen, and then you don't complain if I spoil something for you. Alright, so HBO's Watchmen. I'm conflicted on this. When the series was first announced, I was interested, to say the least, but I was concerned and I still am kind of concerned about it. And the ultimate reason being is Watchmen doesn't need a sequel. It doesn't. The ending of Watchmen almost negates there needing to be a sequel. Now, for those of you who have read the graphic novel or watched the movie, and you know how it ends. It ends with Rorschach's journal being discovered by that one, kid. And Rorschach's journal basically reveals the truth about Adrian Veidt's / Ozymandias's New World Order utopia. The ugly truth behind that, right? And the question is he going to publish that, is he going to publish that journal, or is he just going to throw it away, or do whatever and keep this utopia up, right? Now, a couple important things to know. Rorschach, the character, the character of Rorschach in the comic book was always kind of portrayed, at least in my opinion, as kind of like a conservative, libertarian, almost ANCAP, type person. That's the other thing is, Watchmen is very political. And so Rorschach reflects, I would say, my views a bit in terms of like being a conservative libertarian, but to the extreme, definitely. So he's, more of an ANCAP. Doesn't really trust the government, that much. Questions authority. Doesn't trust authority. Is very distrustful of people in general. Now, I wouldn't say I'm that, way. I'm definitely, much more optimistic about the world. But again, as kind of a conservative libertarian, I definitely am, cautious of the powers that be and whatnot. And I do believe that like Rorschach, that the media is putting society to sleep, and that, it is run by a bunch of, whores and corrupt politicians. And, Trump is starting to drain the swamp, but again, he's not perfect. He's been mired down in that a little bit. So Watchmen is kind of, or I should say Rorschach is kind of the conservative libertarian, question government, question authority, figure of the original comic book series. Night Owl, Dan Dreiberg, is, he's a liberal. He kind of starts off the series. He's going through a midlife crisis. He's kind of turned into a beta male. Until he hooks up with Silk Spectre and kind of regains his, mojo a little bit, both literally and figuratively. Silk Spectre 2, Lori, is a girl with daddy issues, quite literally. And, her arc is pretty interesting. So she's that, character arc. Her mother, the original Silk Spectre is basically a floozy, from the 40s. And, the comedian, Edward Blake, well, he's, he kind of seems like a piece of shit, neocon at first, right? That's his political archetype. Very much a neocon, very much pro-interventionalist. He seems like a big piece of shit, like from the beginning. And once you find out, like a bit more about his background story, you almost like kind of sympathize well, gee, everyone wanted to kill this guy, so someone would have done him in. But then you dive deeper into his story and you find out that he's just as flawed and broken and multi-dimensional as everyone else is, right? All of the characters in Watchmen have traits that are good and traits that could make them evil. And that's what's interesting, is Watchmen is a very philosophical book, and a very philosophy-based story, which kind of questions the paradigms of left and right, and questions the paradigms of morality. And let me just say this: the 2009 movie adoption by Zack Snyder, actually, in my mind, when it originally was released, critics didn't really know how to handle it. It got mediocre reviews from the critics, which were actually, like, a lot of them were pretty bad. But keep in mind, at the time, back in 2009, we were still, like, Iron Man 1 had just come out, and we had The Dark Knight in 2008, like the year before, and that was kind of like the first, realistic, like, gritty take on, Batman and motion pictures. And, like, Iron Man did that a little bit with Iron Man and kind of the character building there, but, like, gritty real world superhero movies were not, like, a thing in 2009. We weren't used to telling, like, the deep, multi-dimensional stories, in comic book movies like we are now. And so when Watchmen came out, it threw people for a loop, and it threw critics for a loop, just like the comic book and graphic novel did when it was published in 86 and 87, right? But ultimately, the original story questions both sides of the political aisle, takes them both to task, and questions human morality, ultimately. And that's what makes it such a good story. HBO's Watchmen, in air quotes, is, well, it should have really been called Wokemen. In heavy air quotes. It is, oh boy. First off, like I said, Watchmen doesn't need a sequel. The ambiguity of the ending of the graphic novel and of the, movie, both of which take place in the 1980s, the ambiguity is how it should have always been. So the fact that we got a sequel kind of, that no one asked for, like, I'm one of those people where it kind of miffs me a little bit, but, okay, it's out there. There's nothing I can do. What does irritate me about this is the fact that, like, even during the, pre-production, This was like during the 2016 election. Damon Lindelof, who has directed and, kind of like created this faux sequel, has said that it's going to be about like white supremacy. And, so it's like more woke SJW culture BS. But who do they choose to, base the white supremacist off of? Not the, is it the neocon Eddie Blake, who, admittedly does do some like sick and twisted and, racist shit in the, original graphic novel? Is it him? No. Is it Night Owl? Is it kind of like the rich liberal billionaire, or inventor? No. Is Ozymandias the even richer, liberal billionaire guy who creates the whole utopia and like kills half the population? In the end of the graphic novel to do this, is it about him? No, he's not. He's not really the villain yet. No. Who does Damon Lindelof pick to be the model for the archetype villain right away? He chooses Rorschach. Now keep in mind, Rorschach dies at the end of the graphic novel. Gets killed by Dr. Manhattan because Dr. Manhattan and Veidt want to keep their utopia kind of like a secret, or the truth about it. And then that's how, when Rorschach, I should say, decides to send his journal to that, kind of conservative libertarian newspaper. So, evidently, that paper publishes Rorschach's journal, and the myth is exposed, right, of the utopia. And in Damon Lindelof's universe, basically a white supremacist group, which wears Rorschach's mask, is the basis for this white supremacist group. Now, as I said in the beginning of this review, like a few minutes ago, Rorschach is a libertarian, kind of like a libertarian anarchist, but he's not really a racist in the, in the comic book. In fact, like, he's not a racist at all. Okay, Rorschach is a guy who in the graphic novel beats up, maims, and kills, white supremacists. There's that one white supremacist gang, in that seedy bar in New York, and, Rorschach beats like a lot of them up, in the bar, and then it's implied later that, he's killed some of them like on the streets. So, obviously he's not a fan of skinheads. He'll kill Rorschach basically kills like, the lowest of the lowest scumbag criminals, like child rapists and murderers, whether they be like, white, black, whatever. He just doesn't like scumbags. He questions authority. He's a libertarian figure, and yet, Damon Lindelof turns the question authority, group into the white supremacist group. Right? So now they've set up the narrative that basically anyone who questions the government, anyone who, questions the police state, is essentially a white supremacist. And that's the other thing, is there is a police state, in Veidt's new utopia. And, the cops also wear masks. So, every utopia kind of becomes a dystopia, and that certainly is the case. Now, the fact that they made the, libertarian Rorschach group, like white supremacists, just be like woke and shit, that pisses me off because, again, there's no need to do that. Second off, they make the police force like super woke with like, a lot of the, police being like woke, African Americans who now are going around, killing like, these quote unquote white supremacists, and it's okay because they're white supremacists, right? So they're deemed evil and, ideology, so they must, die, right? And I mean, look, I'm not even saying this as a conservative that all this pisses me off. I'm coming from a thing of I wish they would be a little more objective. Look, Watchmen, the graphic novel, pokes fun at and points out flaws in, the libertarian ideology, kind of, Rorschach's belief system, the neocon belief system of the comedian in Dr. Manhattan, the liberal, belief system of Night Owl and Silk Spectre, and even like the libertarian views of Rorschach, right? It's very, critical of all sides, the original graphic novel is. This one, this new series, it seems to be white people are bad, white people are ultimately the villains, and, we would like to live in a utopia where eventually, the cops get to kill white folks because of, reparations or whatever. So, it's ridiculous. Now, what I'm hoping they do, like for the second episode and for the third episode, is maybe like turn it around and maybe show like the hypocrisy of the left and focus on that a bit in the show. But, I kind of doubt they will. So, usually I give like episodes, or usually I give like new series 2 or 3 episodes to watch it and really like, let it kind of seep in and figure out if I like it or not. So I'm going to do that, and if I don't like it by, I'm going to say episode 5 just to be safe. There are 9 episodes this season. So if I don't like it, a little bit more than halfway through the season, I'm out. But I will, still watch it, just kind of give it a chance and let it breathe a bit. So, but I would definitely recommend the Watchmen, graphic novel for sure if you can get your hands on that. It's an all-time classic, and I would highly recommend it. So, and depending on how bad this series goes, I'm already thinking that like a lot of fans, myself included, will not include this quote unquote sequel in our canon, personally as fans. So anyway, although DC has kind of messed up with that too, because they actually brought Watchmen into the actual DC universe, and it's a whole thing now. But anyway, so that'll just about do it. Again, not too thrilled with Wokemen. It's actually so unimpressive that like I can't really even remember like any of the character names or anything like that. It's very substandard, I guess, as a movie so far, as a series so far. But I'm hoping they can turn it around. So anyway, folks, that's my review of the series. So thus far of the HBO Wokemen series, as I call it. So that'll do it for the show. One last thing I want to announce before I sign off here. Folks, I am planning on doing a show on Saturday that will be live. However, I don't know if it's going to be on YouTube yet or whether it's going to be on another platform. One of the reasons being is I'm experimenting with like an audio streaming platform that will allow me to do the show live, kind of like live internet radio, and also take phone calls live on air. So I could be doing that method instead of doing like a YouTube live streaming, but I don't know yet. We'll see. Alright, folks, so from all of us here at NGC Studios, have a good day whenever you're listening in the past, present, future hour. God bless, God save this great nation, God, freedom, legacy in that order, and God bless America. I'll see you guys on Saturday for the Saturday edition of the Whitfield Report. And until then, God bless and God save this great nation. Hey there, folks. If you've made it this far to the end of the podcast, I'd like to thank you very much for listening to the show. You are the ones that make it possible for me to make an income from podcasting, and I greatly appreciate that just by listening to our show. You are helping us gain ad revenue. However, if you would really like to help support the show, I encourage you to please donate to the podcast and become a supporter of the show. You can head over to anchor.fm/Whitfield Report and click the support this podcast button and choose the amount that suits you to support the show. Or you can click the link in the show notes and it will directly take you to that page. If you can support the podcast, I really, really appreciate that. Anything that you can do to help out is greatly appreciated. Even if you can't afford to help financially support the podcast, I encourage you to please go on iTunes or Apple Podcasts or Stitcher and please leave this podcast a positive 5-star review. That really helps us out here at the Whitfield Report. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next episode.